So our last panel now will deal with the question of how to actually make UAM happen. And it's being led by Filip Cornelis, who is the Director of Aviation at DG Move. Let me hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Janet, and I'm very happy to be with you. And in a moment, I will introduce some very interesting speakers to you. But while they are being mic'd up, let me give a little bit of context for our panel. We will be focusing together with the representatives of the regulatory side, but also of the manufacturing and private sector side, service provision, on how to make UAM a reality in the coming years. And let me take you back also to my childhood when I was a little boy. I used to be driven around by my mom in town, and of course a lot of traffic jams already existed at the time, and frustrated my mom a lot. And since I of course loved my mom very much, I wanted to help her find a solution. So I drew a flying car. It was not very sophisticated. It was basically a car with a helicopter rotor on top. And my mom was suitably impressed, or at least pretended to be, and said, Philip, you're going to be an engineer. Now, of course, today I'm not an engineer. I am a regulator at the European Commission. I do not contribute to the innovation, except that in my drawing I did not include a tail rotor. I think that was the only innovative element in my design. But luckily, some other people did become engineers, and over the almost 50 years, I have to admit, a lot has happened, and flying cars are coming into reality thanks to technological developments such as automation of flight control, such as battery technology and electric motors. And some very clever people are putting that all together. You are very familiar with that. But we also need to get those vehicles out in the field and have them used. And this is what we will be looking at in our panel, how to make that happen, how to bring them out, how to develop the business cases, how to work with local communities in order to make UAM a reality. So I would like to invite my fellow panelists onto the stage, at least those who are mic'd up already. Not many. Okay. You are resisting. So first of all, we are having Rachel Daschler. Welcome, Rachel. Rachel, probably well known to many of you, is the Director of Certification at EASA since 2019. I will be sitting here, Rachel. Yes, sorry. Sorry. But I'm happy to sit next to you. She's been the head of certification at EASA for a couple of years. She joined the agency in 2004 and has worked in various positions, starting off as a large airplane certification manager. You're going to use an old-fashioned handheld microphone, Pete? Okay, very good. So next I'd like to introduce Pete Bunce. He's president and CEO of GAMA, the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, that promotes, hi Pete, good to see you, that promotes the interest of more than 100 airframe, avionics, engine and component manufacturers. Pete has a background in the US Air Force, but of course is now firmly on the civil side. Also, I would like to call to the stage Kahan Tan from Singapore. He is Senior Director of the Civil Aviation Authority in Singapore, in charge of unmanned systems, and his responsibilities include developing safety policy, developing civil aviation and future aviation technology, safety oversight also for the operation of unmanned systems. We also have Jan-Erik Putze, who is the CEO of Dronik GmbH. Hi. A joint venture of the German ANSP, DFS and Deutsche Telekom. and his company is aiming to become one of the first European U-Space service providers. Jan-Erik was previously working for a subsidiary of DFS and other jobs at the German ANSP. And finally, we are also inviting to the stage Jay Merkel. Hi, Jay, good to see you again. From the Federal Aviation Administration, United States. Jay. The director told me to sit in this chair, so yeah. You can't sit next to Rachel. So Jay, also well known to the drone and unmanned aviation communities, in charge of the FAA's work on the safe integration of drones into the national airspace system in his capacity as executive director of the UAS Integration Office at the FAA. So let me finally take my seat that is still free. Teach me next time I should occupy it right away. Let me start with you, Rachel. You're in charge of certification of everything. And now we have these new vehicles that are coming into your scope of work. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this means for you, particularly with the question of vehicle certification?
Thank you, Filip. So maybe usually we as EASA we tend to be criticized for over-regulating.
No.
But in this particular case, I think regulating is part of the enabling of eVTOL operations and urban air mobility in general. And we saw a little bit the outcome of the societal acceptance study. I think the expectations are high on safety, on security, on the environment. So as a result, I think we are quite busy in defining technical requirements, starting with certification requirements for eVTOL and with technical requirements for drones in a proportionate manner, risk-based, and on
it's not always working. Yeah.
On top of that, we are also active in building the framework that will be needed cross-domain. So obviously we need safe vehicles, safe drones, safe air taxi vehicles, but we need also a safe framework for operations. We need pilots who are appropriately trained and qualified for the new types of machines that will be flying. We need safe integration in the airspace. We need things like noise measurements and in the future probably also noise limits for the machines. So this is just a picture of the regulatory roadmap we are working on. Vertiport specifications is part of it, and we just published technical specification for those. It's a comprehensive work program that we are following. In the domain of certification in particular, we have published what we call the eVTOL special condition, generic special condition, which is a proportionate set of requirements for air taxi type of vehicles. We are also defining standards for ARPAs, medium risk, high risk categories, and we are developing those in, I would say, in a collaborative way with stakeholders, with industry, and in transparency also through public consultations, taking the feedback and progressing as we learn also on the various projects.
Mm-hmm. So when can we expect the first certified UAM vehicle?
Well, that doesn't depend only on us, obviously, but currently we are working with plannings which are as ambitious as 2024 for the first, hopefully first certification.
Thank you, Rachel. Let me move over to the FAA. Jay, as the counterpart of EASA, can you tell us a bit more about how you see things developing in the US on urban air mobility, and what are the differences compared to what's going on here in Europe?
Thank you. Yes, well, since 2019, when I was last on the stage with my colleagues from EASA, our office was asked to take over the job of not just UAS integration, but AAM integration, urban air, or advanced air mobility. So we now have that same responsibility, and as a part of that, we've been collaborating with across the agency. Administrator Dixon asked us to put together a strategy that was a one FAA strategy, so not just aviation safety or the air traffic organization or airports, all of us moving together. And so as a result of that, we also refined our advisory committee where industry gives us advice on how to move forward. And where it was the drone committee, we've converted it to the Advanced Aviation Advisory Committee. But I've noticed a very important distinction in the way we approach our context versus the context I've heard here the last 2 days. And that is, we make a very clear line between drones and AAM. If it has a person on the aircraft, we treat it almost exclusively like any other airplane that we would certify or give an operating certificate or operator credentials, pilot credentials, maintenance, and so we treat the drones very differently. In fact, we've gone so far as to split up our events. We're not even holding our drone event and our AAM event on the same coast. We do think they will mingle, but we wanted to separate them in time and space. So we make that distinction, and where are we in this context? So first off, we look at the aircraft, the operations, the airport, airspace, infrastructure, and then community engagement. And we're trying to make sure we keep all 5 of those components moving together at the pace that people are developing aircraft and operations and the marketplace is developing. In our context, we are using our existing regulations, and there are some changes. We do expect to have to do some exemptions, but we're seeing for the most part moving forward with our current regulations for aircraft certification and pilot qualifications, training, maintenance are all lining up pretty well. There's a few exceptions, a few rough spots, but lining up pretty well. And we are consulting with our EASA colleagues on a monthly basis to make sure that as they're moving forward, we're moving forward and identifying common issues and questions and working on things together. So when we get to the operations side, what we're seeing is the near-term emphasis is very much aligning with the types of certificates we have today. So commercial pilot certificate, maybe with some modifications. But we don't see that there's a need for a tremendous new set of regulations there. And when we get to operations, almost all of the operators who are currently in the process right now are planning to operate their vehicles with standard integration into the airspace, ComNav surveillance, as we know today. Operating commercial pilots, VFR, IFR. So this makes it relatively straightforward for us to start working on the airspace integration. Now there are some wrinkles with how they would like to do their, how their business models fit in the airspace, but by and large they should know how to fly, and we can get them in. Where it starts becoming very interesting is in the infrastructure. We did release our engineering brief, which is similar to the vertiport guidance that you released, has some very common themes. Our folks on both sides have been exchanging ideas. But there's another piece, and this is where you start getting outside the FAA's authorities and the FAA's ability to move the ecosystem as a whole. And that is, there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure that must be put in place, particularly for eVTOL. And so we're seeing an emerging, how should we take a whole of US government approach to integrating VTOL? So it's not just airports, it's making sure that the infrastructure in the cities is prepared. And we've been engaging some of our more progressive cities, like the city of Los Angeles. They've been doing a tremendous amount of work in terms of studying not just the airspace, but how do you integrate surface transportation? If you're electrifying buses and cars and creating these sort of hubs, is that where we should be putting vertiports, or people would want to put vertiports? And then the final piece is really this community engagement, because these are not only different aircraft, they will operate in locations that aren't airports today, and our current community engagement is very much tuned towards engaging people who live in and around airports and deal with traffic issues there. So it's a new type of community engagement, and we see these cities also leading, looking at not just noise and environmental issues, but issues of social justice, societal justice. How do we make sure this isn't just for the rich, and how do we make sure it works for all the people in their cities? So this is the context that we're working from, a whole of FAA, a whole of government, and figuring out how to really start working with our state, local, tribal, and territorial entities that have to do that final work on the ground.
Thank you very much, Jay. And you touched on many topics that I'm sure we will be deepening in the coming minutes, like the differences of approach, the question of airspace integration, interaction with other levels of government. But let me first turn to Kahan, because Jay was mentioning LA. Of course, Singapore is a city-state, and you seem to be, at least to me, uniquely placed as a country to develop UAM, because you are a whole of government by yourself. So how does it work in Singapore? How do you see things developing? What kind of use cases do you see coming forward?
Yeah, thanks, Philip, and thanks to EASA for inviting us. And we have been participating for quite a few years. And I must say, after 2 years, this is my first time out of the country, and this setting is much better than the virtual setting. And I think this is a good way to go. Yes. Jay talked about Los Angeles, and you look at the title, How to Make UAM Happen. I was just reflecting on this morning talk by, DG Move, Hololei talks about, every stakeholder need to work together, and then Patrick talked about nimbleness of the regulations as a regulator, and I kind of chuckle when Florent Reuter talks about, if you draw a circle from a city of Paris, 35 kilometers, pretty much cover, the range. But if you drop a pin in the middle of Singapore, draw 35 kilometers, we are outside of Singapore territorial airspace. We ended up in Indonesia, we ended up in Malaysia. So it is a challenge for us. It is true, Los Angeles is about twice the size of Singapore in terms of real estate. I mean, the land size, about 1,300 square kilometers. We are 730 square kilometers. Los Angeles, about 4 million inhabitants. We are about 5.5 today. And Jay talks about infrastructure. Indeed, infrastructure is a big thing. For Singapore, we can't allocate a plot of land if there is no really return of investment. We could imagine land is very scarce. So we go in a whole of government approach, indeed. In the city-state, but for us, it's a city-state. We do the whole of government approach. What we have been doing over the last few years, in fact, in the recent time, we set up a very high-level government committee, chaired by our permanent secretary, which is DG Move equivalent, to drive this effort, because there's infrastructure requirement. There's a public agency, whether security, safety side, that need to take into consideration, as well as our economic development board to come on board as well. So we do that as an ecosystem, try to get it going. The second part I would say is that in Singapore is a little bit unique. If I were to from airport to the city, I will probably not take this kind of vehicle, because the ground vehicle will move faster than this kind of vehicle, because it's only 20 kilometers, we can get it out in 30 minutes. But the use cases is likely to be that when we look at it, we draw a circle 35 kilometers, even in the context of a first generation of volocopter, it is outside of Singapore. How do we do that? I think there is a lot of bilateral working that we need to do with our neighboring countries. And in terms of certification side, if there is some form of harmonization of the rules, it will be much easier for all of us. I mean, we are looking at EASA, Rachel, as well as the J side. And if it's some sort of harmonization of rules, I think that will be very, very useful. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Kahan. Let me move over to Pete. Now you've heard all the regulators and you can have a go at what they were saying. You are representing a very, very important part of the industry. Of course, traditionally manned aviation. How do you see for you the up and coming new part of the sector of UAM and the increased operations in cities? How does, for the industry association, is the perspective?
Well, thanks, Philip, and I would like to echo what Kahan just said. You know, for us to be able to be together, you know, after 2 years of having to do all of this over the internet and everything is just tremendous, because you never get this type of relationship. And it's aviation that brought us together, for sure, that are able to do that. So I equate this time in history, this must have been what the dawn of the jet age must have been like after World War II, just for all the excitement and all the ability to be able to apply this new technology to be able to go and advance the industry. Now, you've heard the different approaches between Jay and Rochelle, and we as industry are in the middle of that, and I would agree that being able to certify and validate these vehicles, which are global in nature. No one wants to be able to build any type of vehicles that can only be used in Europe or in the United States or any of the other, or in Singapore, wherever. We need to be able to certify them and validate. There is logic behind the different approaches that are being used, and there are pluses and minuses to each one. I am envious, and I've talked with Patrick many times about the nimbleness that we have in Europe to be able to get rules out and through the process, where I know Jay and I have had multiple conversations about how frustrating it is because it's just as slow as molasses in the U.S. to ever do a rule. So there is logic that you would go ahead and certify vehicles using existing rule structure there, because it's almost impossible to get anything done timely otherwise. Where here in Europe, we have a capability to look at this with a fresh set of eyes, all of us, and be able to have industry come with ideas to Rochelle and her team, and to be able to look at, okay, what's the right way to do that? But eventually now we have to think about how we're going to validate. We have some opportunities here. We have a company that's been doing this for a long time, like Embraer, which is developing Eve, and they are certifying with ANAC in Brazil, but they're going to do a concurrent validation, which requires Rochelle and Earl to work together to be able to figure out how all of these rules are going to mesh together. But I think the one thing that does concern us in industry is that we collectively, the regulators and industry, have to map out all of our different standards bodies that we have, and really, you know, we have EuroK, we have RTCA, ASTM, and SAE, and decide, because we all don't have the resources to man each one, to decide how we can leverage those and be able to develop the standards within each one of those bodies, and also send our experts to those to be able to go and then ease the capability to validate later on. Why that also is so important is we're all personnel limited right now. We don't have enough people in our companies. We're about 20% down on all of our companies. We're all competing for talent. We have to learn from each other, and the best way to do that is to be able to develop standards. And it doesn't matter. You know, I had my staff look up the other day how many EuroK standards we just use in business and general aviation, and there are over 80 standards being used. EASA uses standards from ASTM, but we've got to figure out how to leverage those so that the validations go quickly, because that is all this investment that's coming in that the last panel talked about. I mean, it's just daunting, the amount of money coming in, but they won't get a return on investment unless we're able to get these vehicles in the sky and be able to use the rules that either we're promulgating or we already have existing out there to get aircraft into the system. And then we have to be able to have it adaptable so much. We all know that the holy grail or the brass ring is really when we can get to more and more autonomy, because we're very limited on the number of pilots we can produce. It's very expensive to do that. To make these systems cost effective, we're going to have to start taking pilots out of the system and become more and more autonomous as we gain energy, go from the crawl phase to the walk phase to the run phase. And so that's why we have to be thinking about standards, thinking about the rules that we promulgate that are adaptable over time to be able to let this industry grow.
Thanks a lot, Pete, for those thoughts. And again, we'll come back to the question of different approaches and global interoperability. But I first want to go full around on the panel and move over to Jan-Erik. You are a prospective U-Space service provider. How do you see the challenge for your company to prepare for integrating many different vehicles in the airspace?
Yeah, thank you, Philip. And also thanks for being here. It's also our first exhibition for a very, very long time, and it's actually great to see so many people here. But coming back to your question, it's very interesting because actually we as U-Space service provider in Andronic, we try to bring everything what you are doing together and to help our operators to get their drones up flying. So whatever you decide, whatever standards you produce, I'm very happy and even happy that the EASA is doing such a great work in doing that. But we have to use these standards and try to implement that into the existing aviation environment and make drones really a tool. It's not a toy anymore, it's a tool. They fulfill a need for some industries and we try to get them in the air. And we are very happy that we could prove in Hamburg that everything what the EASA is doing, we proved in Hamburg, it's functioning. So we just have to use it and we have to take the drones and bring them up in the air. And of course, we have so many challenges, so we see ourselves, to be honest, as pioneers, because what we are doing with our operators together has no one done before. So whatever we do is actually unique, and we hope that everything we do is good and helps the community. But we see and currently we have actually problems that we don't get much drones in the air as we would like, because the regulation is not, let's say, limiting, current drone operations and BVLOS flights. So we have to take these customers by the hand and help them to get their drones flying. And this is actually what maybe differentiates us from all the others. We try to do it, we try to show it, we try to really make drones fly. And this is we have to do that. Everyone here sitting in the room and is, let's say, operating drones, just get your drones out in the air and fly and make your experience and pass that on. So this is a very important point. But of course, the challenge is that once we talk to more of the operators, they don't come from aviation. I mean, they have no contact with aviation so far. And now we see that we get a highly regulated manned aviation for 40 years, highly regulated, and they meet a more or less, sorry to say that, unregulated drone community, and now they were put aside in an uncontrolled airspace for the time, but now they're coming closer and closer to controlled airspace. And what does that mean? Now they come together with an ANSP, and they come together with controlled airspace and more or less regulations, and they say, well, I didn't know that before. So we really have to find a link to take the drone community seriously, and of course for the let's say aviation environment and aviation community to accept that we have a new partner in aviation. And so we have to combine these two worlds together, and I think this is the major challenge we have to overcome. And I think that's what we are here for, to make that happen.
Thank you very much, Jan-Erik. Kahan and Pete, you very strongly made the point on global standards and global interoperability, and so I would like to come back to Rachel and Jay on that point. And I remember also in the early days of mobile phones that we also had they were only working on each continent separately, and we had to get ourselves another phone to go to another continent. That took years to resolve that. Now, of course, we are used to being able to telephone everywhere. And now that we have this new sector, so to speak, you would think there's an opportunity to avoid such mistakes and to work together from the start. So what is the solution in your view? Is it standards bodies? Is it you sitting together and having your people work together? What can we do to avoid moving in separate directions and having to reconverge afterwards?
Maybe we should distinguish a little bit between vehicle certification requirements and the other domains, because for the vehicle, I think it's clear we all share the goal that they should be exportable, that something we certify in Europe should be able to be validated by the US and vice versa. Which means that at the end, the requirements should not be too different. Now, what we are facing with eVTOLs is a huge variety in innovation and in configurations. You know, some have 6 motors, some have 36, some look more like helicopters, others look more like fixed wing, and many of them are somewhere in between. They are very different, each one from each other, and which means we need quite a lot of flexibility in the way we design the technical requirements. And I think the cooperation with the FAA in that area has been good and is getting better and better every day. And the place where it's happening, it's on common projects. So on common projects where we are both working on, I'm sure we will find ways to harmonize our requirements. And there are some technical challenges to address, like continued safe flight and landing, or battery qualification, which is one of the most difficult challenges to overcome in terms of how do we dimension our safety requirements for the risk related to the batteries. Because if we overdo it, it puts in danger the viability of the project, and if we underdo it, maybe we don't reach the safety target we should be aiming at. And we are in a dialogue with the FAA on all these issues, and we work together on the projects. For the other domains, for operation requirements, flight crew licensing, obviously we have taken slightly different approaches. We have a framework in Europe which requires us to, let's say, to work also on securing a level playing field between 27 countries. That's the answer we are proposing today. In cooperation with all the stakeholders, we are going to put out a number of regulatory proposals out, which are largely based on existing regulations. So the same regulations that are used by the US for pilot licensing, based on commercial pilot licensing, licenses, and operational requirements. The starting point, I think, is the same. Typical commercial helicopter operations. So that in the end, I think we should be able to reach a common safety level and stay aligned on the fundamentals.
I absolutely agree. And back to your question, Philip, does it require certification in national regulatory authorities cooperating? Yes. And what you hear from both of us, and actually you spend much more time with my colleague, Earl Lawrence, but on a monthly basis. And I was talking to one of our aircraft certification colleagues my colleague from the FAA, and I thought he had a very good way of putting this. At the moment, we're taking slightly different paths to the same objective. There are already, and I see the question is, is there a plan to converge? There's already convergence. There's convergence on a number of things. There's also things that neither side completely has figured out what to do. And there are things that we are slightly different, and we're all getting down that path. Does it also require standards bodies and the resources that everyone dedicates to those standards bodies? Yes. So it's a multi-layered. It's the regulators, it's the manufacturers, it's the standards bodies, and it's all of that. And it's continuing to use the methods of cooperation that already are firmly established for other parts of aviation. It really isn't a new problem, and I absolutely agree. It's many different new vehicles, but very similar paths to how you need to solve the problems. So I think we have a good, rich history of how to get to airworthiness. We have a good, rich history of how to get to operations. And we have a good tradition of working together closely, both at the regulator and at the manufacturer regulator and at standards bodies. So I think it will converge. There's just a lot to work through. These are new airplanes.
Yep. Anyone else who would like to react?
Maybe Filip, I just add in, as a regulator, doesn't matter big or small regulator, people like us, we are very small regulator. We don't have the kind of resources that many regulator has. Our objective is really to protect what we needed to protect, safety side of the house, security side of the house, to some extent, and at the same time to allow the production going on, meaning to say the industry to continue to produce. So we're always caught into this, damn if you do, damn if you don't, you know, you're kind of in the dilemma in between the two. For us, we collaborate that quite closely, whether with FAA or whether with EASA. In the context of eVTOL, we work quite closely with EASA, looking at Rachel side on the certification side, on the operation side, on the pilot licensing side. It's quite different in, you know, as a background as a pilot myself, and when you look at this machine, to fly this machine is quite different. Is it a rotorcraft or is it an aeroplane? I don't know. And so it's something that we need to take a step at a time and evolve and continue to go, because I don't think it's any one of our interests, whether it's the EASA, my side, or whether it's the FAA side, if there's an accident, somebody mentioned about it this morning, if there's an accident, it will potentially derail this whole program for an extended period of time. So I think all of us have to collaborate, whether industry, whether it's a regulator, whether it's a government side, we have to collaborate to get it a step at a time. And at the same time, when you do that, you really get the kind of public assurance and acceptance that we all talk about. Otherwise, that's not possible, the way I see it.
Yep.
I would just add, Philip, on the certification side, I was just talking to one of our member companies earlier, Volocopter, and the conversations are already happening on a monthly basis between Rochelle's team and Earl's team. Yep. We want to make sure that industry knows what conversations are going on between the regulators as we do that. So transparency, I think, becomes very important. But I would agree with Jay and Rochelle that we're going to be able to work this out. Again, as I mentioned earlier, and you mentioned, standards, I think, helps with that, and it'll help as we proceed further. On the flight crew licensing, something that I think we all have to take into account is that if you are able to fly these sims, and I would encourage anybody to get in the sim and be able to you realize very quickly how simple they are. I mean, for those of us that have flown helicopters before, it's nothing like that. You basically go over a spot, you hit a button, and it lands. So as you look at what kind of licensing we need, and the fact that in the initial phases, we're going to be operating VFR only. Mm-hmm. Do we need to be so prescriptive on the requirements that we start to that we get a very narrow set of people that can fly them, because that drives up costs. If you have to have a pilot that's both helicopter qualified, fixed wing qualified, and oh, by the way, have the airline transport pilot license and everything, that becomes a very narrow set, and cost starts to skyrocket and everything. Whereas as we look at these vehicles and we see, okay, we can have adaptive standards, and all of our companies, we've got, you know, Airbus, Lilium, Volocopter, all of our companies working together on our second set of concepts that we're proposing, both to EASA and the FAA and ANAC and Transport Canada, all to be able to look at how we can structure this training in some type of aircraft-specific training, but also capturing the automation features in there, and then emphasizing other things that the pilots will need. They still need the basic pilotage skills to be able to look outside, to be able to avoid other traffic, also to be able to communicate until we've gone to direct datacom all the time, and then that changes the dimension of communication. So there's a lot going on here, but I feel actually more confidence that we can work the validation piece on the actual certification of the vehicles together, and the operational side may take a longer time to go and bring those together over time.
Yep. Thank you very much. So on this point, I think I'm happy to conclude that you all agree that on the vehicle side, it's very important to have single approach at global level, and that you're actually working on that. Maybe it's not as visible as the industry would like to see it, but you are, if I understand well, learning by doing or converging by doing, and probably when the first cases will come forward, it will become clearer that you are able to validate quite easily the vehicle certified by the other authorities. So that's very encouraging, and there's a bit more room for maneuver on other aspects like licensing and operations, where some local aspects can play a role, which possibly also have to do with the fact that we are working here, and this was mentioned before, different levels of government are involved. It's not a closed ecosystem like aviation typically has been. On that point, is there anything else to add? What is difficult or different for you as federal regulators and authorities in this area to work with other levels of government?
I'll give a couple examples from our context. At the federal level, we have no authority over land use or zoning. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea of where do you put a vertiport is not something we would ever get involved in, except from the standpoint of those vehicles have to fly in the airspace, and how do you make sure that you are not creating airspace such that people can't really operate. So that's one aspect. Oftentimes people are concerned about more than just noise and environment. They're also concerned about issues of privacy and everything, because now these aircraft are operating in and around areas much closer to their homes and their places of work. They're not separated in an airport. This is something we see in the drone industry a lot. And I saw a really interesting question up here on Slido about what makes a good city for doing this. It's really a city that wants this, because it really does. You have to find communities that where the local cities and states want to help get this into their community. If you're trying to go someplace where that local authority in terms of state government or city government really is indifferent or negative, it's not going to happen. You need somebody who's a partner and is going to help bring that community along with the technology, the operations, and everything.
Yep. And the interesting thing, what I observe is that you do have quite a lot of cities and other entities like ports who are very keen, very interested to get into this area.
Yeah, in our country too, there's a CONUS, or very much for rural areas too, and that's partly why you hear us saying AAM, because there's as much emphasis outside of an intercity. There's very intra-city, and there's also a tremendous demand for using these aircraft for public safety. So for example, in mountainous areas where it's difficult to get to people, or long ranges to get to people quickly and provide emergency medical services. So it's not just in the cities, it's also and we're seeing that develop as well in areas out west where these communities want AAM operating in their areas specifically for public safety.
Yeah. Kahan, you were mentioning cross-border use cases for Singapore. Do you see there additional complications particularly if we see that some of the rules on licensing and ops are going to be allowed to be a bit different?
Well, it certainly is. Once you go cross-border, is international, right? And where is ICAO standards and recommended practices on this kind of operations is not there yet. Though ICAO had Part 101 and 102, but those are very for small aircraft kind of operation, but not in this level. I know our press panel is working on some of these things, but there are Annex 1, Annex 6, and Annex 6 has a little bit, but not as much as that. So that is also why I thought that when you look at urban air mobility, is in many big countries is intra-city, intercity and intra-city. For us in Singapore, such a small city-state, is cross-boundary. And when you go cross-boundary, harmonization of rules, I think that would be useful, whether at the international level or we work bilaterally with our partners. That's what we see. So the question about whether or not, what makes a city attractive for UAM service, I suppose the question should be posed to Florian Reuter if he's here, then he can answer what are the key parts that he chose, which city he should go. And I think one big part certainly is regulatory nimbleness to allow this to happen. Second, before that is really those kind of infrastructures and how the other agency within the government could put in place, whether the infra side, whether the operation side, and to get it happen. So in a nutshell, what Jay says is how much you want it.
I think one of the other interesting things that we're seeing at this point in time, Philip, is that a lot of these companies that are making the machines are also going to be the operating company. So they kind of are taking a longer view. So if you look at a city, one of the biggest limiting factors is the electrical grid infrastructure and how long it takes to get into their cycle, because all of us are going to need to be able, and whether you're talking drones or advanced air mobility, we're going to have power on site to be able to recharge. And right now, the battery technology is not such that we can avoid needing to recharge very often. So as we look at cities and their ability to be able to go and propose, we can go ahead and provide you not only the energy for recharge, but also storage capacity. And then there's all kinds of thoughts about how you can allow electric ground vehicles while they're sitting there in parking lots to be able to go and feed and be an energy storage sink for these types of operations. So there's a lot of planning on the infrastructure side that has to move forward. And then also, if we are going to use hydrogen fuel cells, and a lot of companies are starting to come to that realization that a gaseous hydrogen availability to be able to charge their fuel cell is going to be able to give them an advantage, then how are we going to do a hydrogen distribution network that is robust enough to be able to augment just the electric and battery power?
Yep. So there's quite a few infrastructure challenges, and working with partners that are also new to the community, like the energy providers. Pete, I just wanted to come back. You mentioned the question of automation and your plea not to start necessarily from all the existing rules on ops and licensing, but to really make a new safety assessment and not overdo it. One of the questions on Slido is related to the question of the safety culture. If you're going to have light rules because the vehicles are simple to operate, how do you make sure that the safety culture is still there?
Well, that's, as I understand it, also an interesting dilemma too, with EASA moving forward with the operational rules, which as you look at it and you try to do an approach that's basically suited to the type of vehicle, as we get to the commission level, if we are requiring it to be so prescriptive, then do we have to keep iterating rules as we get more and more automation? So if we accept the fact, and I thought that most of us in aviation on an international basis accepted the concept of performance-based rules, we really need now also the commission to back that up, because unless we have that flexibility, I see that it becomes more difficult for us to go to more highly automated machines. And as you do safety studies all around the planet, the most vulnerable part of aviation is the human element of it. So I think all of us want to go to more and more automation when it's appropriate, and so we want these rules to be able to be adaptive.
Would you say in that sense that the UAM sector is also a laboratory, if you like, for a development in aviation in general towards more automation and different modus operandi?
Yes, certainly. I think what we see on eVTOLs are lots of new innovative technologies that are starting to find their way also on traditional aviation. Such as electric propulsion is a typical example. But coming back to automation and to your comment on pilot licensing, Well, what we are trying to do is, I think we are starting with a reservoir of pilots which have been trained on fixed wing or helicopters, and we are trying to make sure that these pilots can be upskilled to eVTOL in an efficient way. So the initial licensing scheme that we will propose will be based on, let's start with the existing commercial pilot license and add onto that vehicle-specific training. But we see clearly that we will need also another licensing scheme where people are starting from scratch and giving full credit to the automation level we have in the vehicle. And so I think from that angle, we will try to be as flexible as possible and care either for already trained pilots or for pilots who will start to learn flying on this type of machines.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add something?
Yes, please.
I think it's not only the eVTOL sector we should look. I mean, if we talk about aviation culture in the drone industry, it's also, if you talk about light drones, weighing maybe a kilogram or more, because they are also using our airspace. So if we talk about culture and how we want to proceed with air safety, we should take everybody into consideration who's new to the aviation industry, or I would say aviation industry, because we have to tell them why that airspace is safe, and that we have to encourage them to do that, to act like real, let's say, aviation pilots. And this is what we have to train them also in courses. And it doesn't matter how heavy that drone is. Once they are in that airspace, they need to know, don't fly near an airport. Just some do's and don'ts. And once they then, let's say, maybe fly bigger drones or fly eVTOLs, of course, then we have the process of licensing. But culture is for every one of us. It's just in our blood. I'm also a pilot, and whenever I see a drone, I just, and maybe not where it's supposed to be, and I just said, hey, maybe just, yeah, blue sky, no rules, no traffic lights. That's true, but there are some rules, and we have to explain them, and that they have to follow them, and this is something we have to do whenever we talk in that community.
Jan-Erik, a very valid point. My hope would be that also the U-Space service that you and others will be providing will also be part of the safety case, because you will create an environment where it's harder to make mistakes, hopefully, and clearly those services will be digital and highly automated. How do you see the interaction with the traditional ATM that is still very procedural and human-centric? I mean, as a company, you have DFS as a shareholder, who of course comes from that side, but you also have Deutsche Telekom, which is an industry that is completely automated, super interoperable. So how is that going to create or lead to a creative process that will bring that automation and digital safety and security?
That's a tough question.
Yes,
and
that's why you're here.
Dangerous to answer. I think that's why you actually said that. No, first of all, I want to say U-Space is great, but currently our operation is done outside U-Space. So if we talk about U-Space, we also should take about what do we do outside U-Space. And for me, key is visibility for everybody, even if it's manned or unmanned, if you fly controlled, uncontrolled airspace. It's not to send a bill because you've done something wrong, but it's just to have a complete picture of, let's say, the aircrafts which are around you. But of course, it's a very difficult question, because we have now to bring together two worlds, as I said before. It's the ANSP world, and then maybe the drone community. And yeah, it's really a tough question, because we have the drones are flying very low currently, and ANSPs, they don't have the view of that traffic in that air, because it's just too low, and we definitely have no radar coverage. So we have to, let's say, set up an infrastructure making these drones first of all visible, and then once they are visible, we have to integrate them into an ANSP world. And as we know, integrating something in the existing ANSP environment takes time. Why does it take time? Because it has to be safe, secure, and of course it has to follow certain standards. So currently it's possible to integrate drones, manned and unmanned traffic in one view, but currently it's difficult to display that also in an ANSP world, because we have to tell the controller in addition what he has to do when he sees a drone. So now if a normal aircraft, let's say, stops the approach and goes for go-around, the controller knows exactly what to do. But what does he do if he sees a drone? So we have to, it's not only making it visible, but we often have to set up the rules behind for everyone to know what to do if he sees a certain period of a certain drone. And the drone doesn't, let's say, have a predicted path. The drone can make, like, say, circles whenever, and this is also different to the current manned aviation. So I think if we solve the problem, first of all, the visibility is key for everyone, and the second thing is if we have it, we have a combined view, and then we have, let's say, to integrate them into the existing aviation manned environment and tell the controller what to do. And you're right, currently it's the controller and then the system is around it, but I think in future it's the system and the, let's say, controller does everything what the system cannot do. And I think this is the view we have to change. And this is actually a change process. And everyone here in the room should know what a change for a person means. You are scared, you're afraid, you don't know what's going to happen. And also we have to tackle this issue also. But this is something that it will come. And we have to follow that.
And maybe the digital European sky will help push that change process and lead to a convergence over time, which is probably unavoidable over time. Yeah. Any comments of the other panelists on the navigation piece? Do you see this as a challenge, or it's somebody else's problem?
Well, I think as we look at first of all, we could very easily overwhelm any of the ANSPs that are out there, any place on the planet. So we have to think in terms of something different. We also need to realize that a lot of the advanced air mobility or urban air mobility vehicles are going to try to get out of that low altitude airspace very quickly because it will be very dense with drones. So that now means that they will interact with the normal traffic that you're going to see, the general aviation traffic, or also aircraft going into airports. But if you think about it in a tube concept, where it's traveling in a prescribed tube from point A to point B, where people then in the outskirts of a city can jump in their vehicles and go home, it starts to become an easier problem because that's prescribed. So, a lot of people that just say it's going to overwhelm the system, I don't think in much of terms of thinking in 3 dimensions and thinking about the capability that we have there. And then we already know, and we can build in the capability within these vehicles to have avoidance. Mm-hmm. Now, again, the human frailties and everything right now for all the pilots that are here to be able to see a drone with our eyes is very, very difficult. We have to have electronic means to enhance where that drone is if we even want to have a chance of trying to maneuver the vehicle and avoid it. Mm. What we need to have is the automated systems that'll do that for us.
Yep. Okay. And 3 dimensions do have a big advantage over 2 dimensions, that's clear. Jay, you want to come in?
I'm not terribly concerned about the AAM, UAM overwhelming the system, even in dense airspace, partly because there are already the limits there that will cause them not to. But there's also the adaptive airspace ideas that we already use today for other communities that maybe don't integrate well with arrival and departure paths to transition dense airspace. VFR corridors, helicopter routes. We've got a number of these structures. And it is when I was much younger in this business at one point, and at that point, somebody told me something very clever. And they said, the easiest way to get air traffic to understand how to do something new is to compare it to something they already know how to do and show them that you're really just extending that idea. And I think what Pete is putting forward with the tubes, what some people have called corridors, it really is that extension of existing airspace structures that can then be used. I'm also not concerned above certain levels, and I'm not going to name an altitude at the moment, but it's lower than 500 feet. I don't think there's above 500 feet, it's at the moment very unlikely that you're going to see a lot of density of drones operating above there. The business model just doesn't work for them right now to try and get up to that altitude and get in the middle of standard air traffic. That doesn't work. There are cases where it makes sense, but by and large, it's easier for them to operate. And that's where we see the market demand, at least in the United States, is largely below 500 feet. So I'm not as concerned. I'm concerned, but I think the structures are already there to deal with it. And I think the market is sort of sorting itself out as well.
Can I just add something? You're absolutely right. And I would also say, if everyone stick to his rules, we have actually kind of a safety anyway. I mean, if you don't go below 500 feet, why should a manned aircraft go below 500 feet? If he's not an emergency helicopter or a police helicopter, why should he do that? And if he stays above...
Or within 100 feet of a power line?
Yeah, was also, yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, it's not good to be there in that altitude if you're manned. But anyway, if you stick to your rules, there's a rule set already existing. And if we just use that and don't find excuses why we should not use it, we have kind of a safety environment already. I would totally agree.
Thank you. I'm just picking up now on the Slido here. Interesting, somewhat provocative question. Why would a pilot start a career in eVTOL if eVTOLs will be autonomous in a few years? Doesn't sound like a very good career.
Well, actually, you know, we talked to a lot of the pilot unions early on, and they were a little fearful of you know, pilots in this realm, and all of a sudden they realized, with the pilot shortage that we have worldwide right now, that this is a great training element for them. Now, a lot of these vehicles aren't going to fly like a traditional aircraft would fly with ailerons and elevators and rudders and everything else. In fact, as you turn it, it may turn in just one plane, and also it's differential thrust that's going to turn you versus actually control surfaces sometimes. And so all of those piloted skills that you may learn conventionally don't have that same applicability, but you're learning all those other things, those pilot skills. So as a feeder to the commercial airlines, and of course it's all going to be, that labor is going to be priced at certain levels where it can be an incentive. Right now, a lot of times we let brand new pilots gain flight time becoming instructor pilots for other pilots, and then they have no experience whatsoever. That's not the best way to be able to train pilots. You want to have them gain experience out there in the system.
Yep.
But maybe just let me add, because eVTOLs, we have to clarify, where is the pilot sitting? Is the pilot sitting in the eVTOL, or is he sitting on ground maneuvering, let's say, the drone, let's say, from his PC? And I think at the end, he will not sit in that aircraft because he will control the airspace on a control level on the ground. And I think this is the future. And I can also, maybe another idea, why is a controller not also a pilot monitoring an eVTOL and, let's say, giving input? Why couldn't he do that? So, I mean, we have to look at, let's say, job profiles, to be honest, and to really explain eVTOLs. Yeah, so they are flying, but they will be controlled from the ground, I would say.
And as... Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to add that this is a very interesting question because in the first place, this is a new segment of the aviation industry. It is sunrise industry, it's not a sunset industry. We all know that. It's a question of how fast it will rise, right? Second is that the word pilot, redefine the word pilot means in this sunrise industry. Is it something new? No. Eamon talks about military, right? Military, they were doing that right out of far away, and that machine is flying thousands of miles away. So it's just a redefine of what our normal conception of what pilot means. But the skills can be different, but it's still pilot.
Yep. And except you don't have a fancy uniform.
You can, if you want to, in front of under control, you can have fancy uniform too. Yeah.
And as a non-pilot, I'll admit it, this looks like it was written by a pilot because it's the fear that that job will no longer be there. But if I struck the word pilot and said, why would I start a career in eVTOLs? Exactly for all the reasons Pete said, right? And I could strike eVTOLs and replace that with drones. Why would I start a career in drones? It's really the same question. Why do I want to start a career in the most exciting segment of aviation in the last 60 years. That's why, because it is going to be a long career, because it is exciting. And yes, traditional aviation, and we will be a feeder to that for some folks. But some folks will find fulfilling careers, either in drones or in eVTOLs. But it's expanding the aviation career universe. It's not contracting it.
But of
That's
course,
a very nice message to end our panel, by the way. But first, Jan-Erik.
the only thing is the pilot has to stay at home. So he cannot fly away.
I don't care where they stay.
Yeah, well, homework is something we've all learned recently, so it should be okay. Well, time is up, but I don't want to close before giving everybody the chance to share really in one sentence the one key issue for you that is needed to make UAM a reality. What kind of takeaway would you like to give our audience today? And let's start with Rachel.
Maybe just to say that I think what we see is the emergence of really new, a new transport mode, and that we have together to build the right framework for that cooperatively.
Pete.
Since I represent global manufacturers, it's definitely the aircraft that we certify, whether it's Rochelle's team, Earl's team, ANAC, or Transport Canada, they're all going to be safe. It's how do we validate them and let the methodology that we're certifying these aircraft be able to be looked at by all other authorities and recognize the safety competencies that we have in all of these bilateral safety agreements.
Thank you very much. Kahan?
Well, one reflection I have from this morning, the presentation and looking around is that all this eVTOL company, they want to do the value chain through and through, from the manufacturing side to the continuing airworthiness side, to the operation side, also to, say, pilot licensing. They want to be ATO. The question for us as a regulator is, how do we manage conflict of interest? This kind of profile, it doesn't happen in the manned aviation. We always try to, kind of make sure that there's no conflict of interest. But if a particular entity running all those things from end to end, how do we ensure conflict of interest is minimized?
Jan-Erik?
Love flying. Go out there and fly, no matter what kind of resistance you have. Go out there and show everyone it's functioning and it's working and make your experience.
There's a pilot speaking. Jay?
It's cliche, but this is a team sport. It requires regulators, manufacturers, operators, and most importantly, it requires those communities that need to embrace this. And I think we need to remember, particularly since we're going to new parts of communities, that all of us need to bring that team player along and help them learn the sport.
Thank you very much, Rachel, Pete, Kahan, Jan-Erik, and Jay. A warm applause from the audience, please.
Thank you very much to all of the panel. And we're now going to move on to our closing remarks, which will come from EASA Executive Director, Patrick Key, who will also then close day one of the conference for today. So, thank you.
So, I'm the only person which is between you and drinks, so I will be very, very brief. Today we had a wonderful grand opening of Amsterdam Drone Week and EASA high-level conference, and we had inspiring keynote speeches from the Commissioner for Transport and the Director General of DG Move. We had exciting panel discussions on societal acceptance, stakeholder coordination, and the journey around the world on UAM roadmaps. We've learned that we will soon have the Drone Strategy 2.0 from the European Commission that will provide new objectives for the UAM sector, built on the existing ones and going towards green and smart mobility. We are on the right path, it seems, but we all need to adapt and innovate and keep up with the pace of industry if we want to continue to set the standards for the world in the area of UAS and safety. We'll still need to work together as we have done in the past years and even get better at doing that so as to maintain and improve whenever possible our high level of safety in Europe. Today, I would like to close this first day of the EASA high-level conference giving a big thank you to all the keynote speakers, moderators, panelists, organizers, the technical support team, and of course, my team from EASA. And there is one person I would like to thank. She's all in red so that you cannot miss her. Can you please stand up? Maria. And my EASA colleagues, they are all in the corner here. Please stand up and be recognized.
Me too, I miss it.
So, I don't know what to say anymore. Sorry. I hope that you have enjoyed this first day of the conference as much as I did. And I was really today delighted to see in person so many partners, colleagues, and friends. Even though there are difficult geopolitical circumstances, we made it to Amsterdam and we had pleasure in meeting each other. Tomorrow, we will have a series of very interesting technical workshops and a lot more opportunities for networking and continuing that feeling that we are working together. All those workshops are starting at 9 o'clock in rooms 1 floor up. Thank you very much for coming to Amsterdam, and I look forward to meeting a number of you in the next hours and day. Last but not least, I would like to take the opportunity to announce the new dates for next year's edition of the EASA high-level conference on drones and Amsterdam Drone Week. It's going to be between the 21st and the 23rd of March 2023. 21st to 23rd of March 2023. Kahan, Jay, Pete, put it in your calendar. We count on you. And I hope to see you all there, and maybe also all those of you who joined us virtually today. We have now the most important part of the day, which is networking drinks, which are offered by the Amsterdam Drone Week and Council, and they are served just outside of the auditorium. For those who are here today with us in Amsterdam, please join us there and have a very nice evening. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you.